The box was sitting on her kitchen table when Abigail Dawson came downstairs that Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, and she knew before she even touched it that something in her world had shifted so completely that nothing would ever go back to the shape it had been before. It was not the box itself that struck her breathless. It was what was inside it. Her mother's silver locket, the one stolen from her neck on the road to Caldwell, Kansas, 2 years prior. Her father's pocket watch, the one with the scratched initials RD on the back that she had pressed to her ear as a child to hear the tiny heartbeat of its mechanism. The deed to the 40 acres her brother Thomas had lost in a rigged card game at the Silver Spur Saloon. $43 in paper bills bound with a strip of rawhide. A small glass bottle of rose perfume that had been on her dresser and then, one morning, was simply gone. And underneath it all, a note written in a tight, controlled hand on brown paper that read, "I took what was not mine to take. This belongs to you, every piece of it. I am sorry." There was no name signed to the note. But Abigail Dawson did not need a name. She had known that handwriting for longer than she had been willing to admit to herself, and the recognition of it hit her somewhere below the ribs. In the soft place she had spent 2 years trying to armor over with bitterness and practical sense, and the daily repetition of telling herself that Joel Barnett was a thief, a liar, and a man who deserved whatever end the territory eventually handed him. She sat down hard in the chair at the kitchen table and pressed her mother's locket against her collarbone and did not cry, because she had learned long ago that crying changed nothing on the frontier. The Kansas wind did not care about your grief. The dry earth did not soften because of your tears. You simply had to decide what to do next and keep doing it. But then she looked to the front door, which was still slightly ajar, letting in the cold morning air, and through the gap she could see the edge of her front step. And there, sitting in the pale yellow dawn light, was a single wildflower. A purple prairie violet, small and stubborn and wildly out of place, the kind that pushed up through cracked clay soil after hard rain, the kind that had no business being that beautiful given everything it had to push through to get there. She stood up slowly, walked to the door, and stood in the frame for a long moment, looking at that flower. The road beyond her fence was empty. The cottonwood at the edge of her property shifted in the early wind. Somewhere in the direction of town, a rooster was arguing with the morning. Joel Barnett was gone. He had come in the night, returned everything, left a single flower and disappeared. And Abigail Dawson stood in the doorway of her small clapboard house on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, in the year of our Lord 1883, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. She was 26 years old. She had survived drought and a hard winter and her father's death and the robbery that had taken so much more than just objects from her family. She had built something careful and deliberate out of the wreckage, a routine, a reputation for being sensible and steady, a small dairy operation with 4 cows and a vegetable garden that she traded at the Caldwell market every Saturday. She had told herself she was fine. She had almost believed it. And now this. She picked up the violet very carefully, as if it were made of something more breakable than petals and stem. She held it for a moment. Then she set it in the water glass on the windowsill of her kitchen, next to the locket and the watch and the deed, and she sat back down at the table to think. Because if Joel Barnett had come back to Caldwell even once, he was close enough to find. And Abigail Dawson, despite everything, despite all of it, had questions that needed answering. Real, serious questions. Questions that had been sitting in her chest for 2 years like splinters she could not quite reach to pull out. She had about 3 hours before her cows needed milking. She used one of them to make a decision that any sensible woman on the Kansas frontier in 1883 would have told her was dangerous and foolish and entirely beneath her dignity. She was going to find him. 2 years earlier, the Dawson family had been having what they called a good season. Abigail's father, Robert Dawson, had managed to pay down most of the mortgage on the homestead, through a combination of the dairy operation Abigail had largely built herself, Thomas's occasional hired hand work at the Brinkman Ranch, and the sale of 3 horses Robert had raised from foals with particular attention and patience. They had not been wealthy, not by any stretch, but they had been stable, which on the Kansas frontier felt very much like wealth. The robbery happened on the road between Caldwell and Wellington in late October of 1881. Robert Dawson and Abigail had been coming back from Wellington, where they had sold the last horse, a beautiful roan stallion, for $60. It was a 2-day journey, and they had made camp near Bluff Creek when 4 riders came out of the tree line at dusk. Abigail had been the one awake. Her father had fallen asleep wrapped in his wool coat against the autumn cold, and she had been sitting by the small fire, reading by its light, when she heard the horses. She had stood up and turned, and the riders were already in the firelight, their faces covered with bandanas, their horses blocking the road. The leader had been tall in the saddle, dark-eyed. When he had looked at her across the fire, something in his gaze had been wrong for the situation, wrong in the sense that it had not been hard and predatory the way she had expected. It had been something more complicated, something that looked uncomfortably like regret, even as his men went through their saddlebags and took the $60 from the sale of the roan, and her mother's locket from around her neck and her father's watch from his vest pocket, and the small bottle of rose perfume that had been a birthday gift from her mother 3 years before her mother had died. They had not hurt them. That was the thing Abigail had held onto afterward with a particular kind of complicated feeling. The other men had been rough and dismissive, but the tall one had held up a hand when one of his companions had shoved her father too hard, and the shoving had stopped. He had looked at Abigail once more before they rode, and she had been angry enough by then to look straight back at him, to let him see exactly what she thought of him, and he had dropped his gaze first, which was the only satisfaction she had. They had filed a report in Caldwell when they got back. The sheriff at the time, a man named Crawford, had told them that the description matched a gang operating out of the territory, led by a man who went by various names. When Abigail had asked for the real name, Crawford had paused and said, "Joel Barnett, ma'am, though he won't be using it much longer if this territory has anything to say about it." The name had lodged in her memory like a thorn. In the months after, she had heard more. Joel Barnett was from Pratt County, originally. He had been a cattle drover in his early 20s, working the Chisholm Trail out of Texas. Something had happened, people said different things about what, and he had ended up on the wrong side of the law around 1878 or 1879. By 1881, when he had robbed the Dawsons on the Wellington Road, he had been operating for about 2 years with a crew of 4 or 5 men who changed periodically, doing road robberies and occasionally hitting the payroll shipments for the smaller ranching operations. He had never killed anyone. That was also something people said, sometimes in his defense, sometimes simply as a note of distinction. Crawford said it meant nothing, that it was only a matter of time. Abigail had said nothing, because she found the distinction more complicated than she wanted it to be. She had spent the first year after the robbery doing exactly what the frontier required, putting her head down and working. Her father's health had declined through the winter, and she suspected, though she could never prove it, that the shame of having been robbed in front of his daughter had done something to him that the cold and the hard labor had only finished off. Robert Dawson died in February of 1882, quietly in his bed, with Abigail holding one hand and Thomas holding the other. After that, the homestead had been entirely hers to manage. Thomas was willing but not particularly suited to it, and by the summer of 1882 he had taken a permanent position at the Brinkman Ranch, coming home on Sundays. Abigail had managed the dairy, the garden, the house, the books, the market stall, and the long winter alone, and she had done it with the kind of grinding determination that earned her a particular reputation in Caldwell. Dependable, self-sufficient, not someone you needed to worry about. The card game that had taken Thomas's 40 acres happened in November of 1882. Thomas was not a drinking man usually, but he had been celebrating the end of the Brinkman Fall Drive with the other hands, and a man with clever hands and an easy smile had suggested a friendly game. By the time Thomas understood that the game was not friendly, the deed had been on the table, and then it was not. Thomas had come to Abigail's door the next morning, gray and hollow-eyed with shame, and she had listened to the whole story without interrupting, which was how she did things, and then she had said, "All right, we will figure it out." She had not yet understood that the man with the clever hands was connected to Joel Barnett. She had not known that for a long time until now, until the note on her kitchen table. Abigail Dawson was not a reckless woman. She was thoughtful, patient, more given to planning than impulse. But she was also, when the situation required it, deeply stubborn, and the sight of that wildflower on her step had stirred something in her that sat right alongside the stubbornness. Something she was not quite ready to name, but that felt very much like the kind of feeling that made sensible women do things that were not entirely sensible. She told her neighbor Mrs. Holt, who was 60 and practical and had been a fixture on the road since before Abigail was born, that she was going to ride into Caldwell proper on some business. She milked her cows first, because the cows could not be left, and then she saddled her brown mare, Clara, and rode the 2 miles into town. Caldwell in 1883 was a busy place. It sat on the Kansas Indian Territory border and served as a major cattle shipping point on the Chisholm Trail, which meant it had all the particular energy of a town that was both respectable and dangerous, depending on which street you were on and what time of day it was. The cattle season had not started yet. It was early April, but the town was already stirring, merchants restocking, saloons being freshly whitewashed after a hard winter, the railroad depot receiving its first supply shipments. Abigail went first to the sheriff's office, not Crawford, who had retired, but the new sheriff, a compact, serious man named Elroy Hayes who had been appointed the previous year. She liked Hayes. He was honest in a way that was rarer than it should have been. She showed him the note and told him what had been returned. She watched his face carefully as he read. He looked up at her. "You are sure it is Barnett's hand?" "I have seen the wanted notices," she said. "The signature on the notices matches what is in front of you." Hayes folded the note carefully and set it on his desk. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, using the honorific that people had defaulted to since her father's death even though she had never been married, "if Joel Barnett has come near Caldwell, I need to know about it officially. What you have brought me is evidence that he was at your property." "I am aware," she said. "I am not here to protect him. I am here to ask if you know where he is." Hayes looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man deciding how much to say. "There are reports," he said carefully, "of a single rider camping in the breaks south of town. Could be anyone, could be a drifter, but the timing," he paused, "the timing is interesting." "South of town," Abigail said. "Mrs. Dawson," his voice was careful now, with an edge of something that was not quite warning but was close to it. "Whatever you are thinking, I would ask you to let me handle this." "I intend to," she said, which was mostly true. She left the sheriff's office, walked back to where Clara was hitched, and stood in the April sunlight on the main street of Caldwell for a moment, thinking. Then she rode south. The breaks south of Caldwell were a stretch of rough ground where the flat prairie began to cut up into small ravines and creek channels, dotted with cottonwood stands and low scrub. In summer they were thick with vegetation, and in winter they were desolate, but in early April they were somewhere between, the cottonwoods just beginning to leaf, the grass coming up thin and green through the old brown, the creeks running with snowmelt from further north. She did not find him immediately. She rode for nearly an hour through the breaks, following the creek, and had almost convinced herself she was being foolish when she crested a low bank and saw the smoke. It was a careful fire, small and contained, the kind of fire built by someone who knew how to be hard to find. The camp was tucked into a bend of the creek where a stand of cottonwoods gave cover from 3 sides. A gray horse was picketed in the grass near the water. There was a bedroll, a pack, a small iron pan, and a man sitting with his back against a cottonwood trunk, watching her approach with an expression she could not yet read from this distance. She pulled Clara to a stop about 30 feet out. They looked at each other across the space. Joel Barnett was 31 years old, and he looked like a man who had been living hard for a long time. He was lean in the way of men who moved constantly and ate irregularly, with weathered skin and dark eyes under the brim of a hat that had seen better years. He had a week's growth of beard, and his clothes, though travel-worn, were not disreputable. He looked, Abigail thought with a complicated jolt, less like the threatening figure she had constructed in her memory, and more like a very tired man sitting by a creek. He did not reach for the revolver on his hip. He did not stand up. He just looked at her, with that expression she had been trying to read from 30 feet, and now that she was closer she understood what it was. He had been expecting her. "Abigail Dawson," he said. His voice was quiet and level, not a question. "Joel Barnett," she said back in the same register. Neither of them moved for a moment. The creek ran. A meadowlark somewhere in the cottonwoods made its particular spiraling call. "You found the box," he said. "I found the box," she said. "And the flower." Something moved in his face at that, something small and quick that he controlled almost immediately. "I wanted you to know it was deliberate," he said. "Not just someone leaving things in the dark." Abigail looked at him carefully. She had been planning this conversation in her head for the 2-hour ride out here, running through what she needed to say, and now that she was here, the planned conversation felt less useful than just watching his face. "Get down," he said. "If you want to talk, you do not have to stand on your horse to be safe here." She considered it for a moment. Then she dismounted and tied Clara's reins loosely to a low branch, still outside his camp but no longer mounted. "I want to understand," she said. "Not just the returning, the taking in the first place." Joel looked at the fire for a moment. "That is fair," he said. "Sit down if you want. I am fine standing." "All right." He rested his forearms on his knees and looked up at her. The morning light through the cottonwood leaves moved across his face. "Your father and you were carrying $60 from Wellington. That was money my information said was going to be used to pay a debt to a man named Colton Marsh." Abigail went very still. "Colton Marsh," she said slowly. "He was calling in debts all across Sumner County that fall. Your father owed him from a land note from 4 years before. The story I had was that Marsh had a claim on your place if the note came due and was not settled, and that the $60 was the last of what your father needed to settle it." "That is exactly right," Abigail said quietly. "That is exactly what that money was for." "I know that now," Joel said. His voice was level, but there was something beneath it, something that cost him something. "I did not know it then, or I told myself I did not know it because the money was too easy and I did not look hard enough at what it meant to your family. I took it because it was there and I needed it, and I did not think hard enough about the person it was coming from." "My father lost the 40 acres, Abigail said. "I know. He died 8 months later." The silence that followed that was long and very heavy. "I know that too," Joel said. "I found out the winter after. About the land, about Marsh, about your father." He paused. "About you, what you were managing alone." "You have been watching," she said. It was not accusatory, not exactly, but it was not comfortable either. "Not in a way that was meant to frighten you," he said. "In a way that was meant to understand the full debt. What had been taken, what needed to come back." He looked up at her directly. "The card game that took your brother's deed, that was one of Marsh's men. Someone I had done business with before I knew what Marsh's game was. When I found out what had happened, I went and got the deed back. It took 3 months and it was not a friendly conversation." Abigail thought about what getting a deed back from one of Colton Marsh's men would have involved and decided not to examine that too closely right now. "The money," she said, "the $43. The 60 was gone. I spent it in ways that cannot be undone. The 43 is what I had that I could put back." Abigail was quiet for a moment. The meadowlark called again. Clara shifted her weight behind her. "Why now?" she said. "Why did you wait until this spring?" Joel was quiet for a moment. "Because it took this long to get everything together. The deed was the hardest thing. The locket and the watch I had kept. The perfume. He stopped. I kept the perfume because it smelled like something I wanted to remember, and I kept it long enough to know that was wrong, and I brought it back. Something about that particular admission did something to Abigail's chest that she was not prepared for. She looked away from him and across the creek at the new green grass on the far bank. "What are you going to do now?" she said. "Sheriff Hayes knows you are in the break south of town." "I know. I went to Hayes first." That surprised her. She turned back to look at him. "Yesterday evening," he said, "before I came to your place, I went to Hayes and I told him where I had been for the past 2 years and what I had been doing. I gave him a full account, and he let you go. He let me go until he had time to wire the marshal's office for instructions. He gave me 48 hours to stay in the area and not run." Joel's voice was matter-of-fact about this, the way people on the frontier talked about serious things. "I am not going to run." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. The tiredness in his face was not just the tiredness of traveling. It was the tiredness of carrying something for a long time and being ready to put it down. "I need to go home," she said finally. "I have livestock." "I know. This is not finished," she said. "I know that too." She untied Clara and remounted. She looked down at him from the saddle for a moment, and he looked back up at her, and the morning light was very clear and the air smelled like creek water and new cottonwood leaves, and somewhere in the distance Caldwell was going about its Tuesday business. "I found the wildflower on my step," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was a prairie violet." "Yes. Those grow in very specific conditions," she said. "Rocky soil, recently disturbed ground. They are hard to find in early April." Joel was quiet. "It must have taken you some time to find one," she said. A pause. "Some time," he said. Abigail Dawson turned her horse toward town and rode without looking back, which required considerably more effort than she would have liked to admit. The next 48 hours were possibly the strangest of her life, and her life had contained some genuinely strange periods. She went home and did her chores and cooked her supper and sat in the evening with her mending and tried to think clearly about what was happening. Her mother's locket was around her neck. Her father's watch was on the shelf above the stove where it had always been. The deed to Thomas's 40 acres was in the tin box where she kept important papers. She sent Thomas a message with the boy from the Brinkman Ranch who came through on Wednesday, telling him to come on Saturday. She did not explain why. Thomas would come and she would show him the deed, and that would be its own conversation. On Thursday morning she rode back to the breaks. She had told herself she was riding out to check whether Joel was still there, as a matter of practical information, because if he had left the area she should know that. That was what she told herself. It was not entirely dishonest. It was also not entirely honest. He was still there. He had a tin cup of coffee on the fire when she came through the cottonwoods, and he looked up, and there was something in his face that was not surprise exactly, more like the careful, still expression of a man who had hoped for something and was not letting himself show the full weight of it. "I have questions," she said, tying Clara to the same branch as before. "All right," he said. He lifted the coffee cup in a gesture that offered her some, and she came into the camp and sat on a flat rock near the fire and accepted the cup. The coffee was strong and bitter and very welcome in the early morning cold. "How old are you?" she said. He looked slightly startled by that as an opening. 31, he said. 32 in August. We're in Pratt County, east of Iuka. My family had a homestead there. My father ran cattle." "What happened?" she said. "The cattle driving the trail years. How did you end up where you ended up?" Joel was quiet for a moment. He refilled his own cup from the small pot on the fire. She could see him deciding how much to say, and she could see the moment he decided to say all of it. "My father owed debts," he said. "Not to Marsh, different men, but the same kind of men. I was working the Chisholm Trail out of Texas when I got word that the homestead was going to be taken. I rode back and arrived 3 days after they had already foreclosed. My mother and my younger sister were staying with a neighbor. My father had taken a horse and gone, and we never heard from him again." Abigail listened without interrupting. "I had money from the drive, not enough. I thought I could find the men my father owed and negotiate something by time something. But that is not how those men work. His jaw tightened briefly. I had a friend from the trail years, a man named Heck Doran. Heck had been outside the law for about a year by then. He said there was an easier way to get the money. He was not wrong about the easy part. But you could not buy the homestead back. No, by the time we had the money, the land had been sold and built on. It was gone. He looked at the fire. My mother died in 1880. My sister married a man in Dodge City. She is fine, last I heard. The homestead is gone. The debt I thought I was solving is gone. And I spent 2 years after that doing something I knew was wrong because I had already started it and did not know how to stop. He said it simply, without dramatics, and that simplicity made it more affecting than a more theatrical account would have been. Heck Doran, Abigail said. Is he the one who organized the robbery on the Wellington Road? Yes. Heck picked the targets. I rode with the crew. I am not pretending I had no choice in it. I had a choice every time. And the others in the crew. Doran is in the federal prison in Leavenworth, caught in February of last year on a separate matter. The others I have not ridden with since 1882. He paused. When your father died, I stopped. That is not a noble statement. It should have been stopped long before. Abigail looked at the fire for a moment. The morning light was coming stronger now, filtering through the new cottonwood leaves. You said you were not going to run, she said. What do you expect to happen? I do not know exactly. Hayes said the marshal's office would consider the full account I gave, and the fact that I returned voluntarily and cooperated. There are no charges outstanding in Kansas specifically for the Wellington Road robbery. The $60 was the main item of record, and there is no one remaining to press the charge with your father gone. My brother could press it, Abigail said. Yes, Joel said. He could. The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than hostile. I am not going to tell Thomas to press it, Abigail said. I want to be clear that I am not saying that because I am soft on what you did. I am saying it because I watched what the law's pursuit of you did not accomplish in 2 years. And I think a man who shows up voluntarily and returns what he took and cooperates with the marshal is more useful to this territory alive and free than in a federal prison. She surprised herself with the clarity of it. She had not known that was what she thought until she heard herself say it. Joel Barnett looked at her with that expression she was starting to be able to read, the one that was full of things he was being careful about. That is generous, he said. It is practical, she said. There is a difference. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything like that on his face, and it changed his whole aspect, turned him briefly into someone younger and lighter. What are you going to do, she said, assuming the marshal's office agrees with Hayes's assessment and you are free to stay? I have been thinking about that, he said. I know cattle, I know the trail. Brinkman is hiring for the spring drive. I saw his notice in Caldwell. My brother works for Brinkman, she said. I know. She thought about that for a moment. Thomas will need to know everything, she said. He cannot work alongside you not knowing. I would not ask him to, Joel said. Abigail stood up and handed back the tin cup. She looked at him from a standing position, and he looked up at her from the rock where he was sitting, and for a moment she was very aware of how close the camp was, how quiet the breaks were, how long it had been since she had sat by a fire with another person and talked the way she had just been talking. I will come again on Friday, she said, before she had quite decided to. All right, he said quietly. She rode home thinking about secrets and dark pasts, and how the frontier had a way of making conventional judgments feel thin and inadequate. She thought about her father, who had been a good man who made hard choices. She thought about her own choices, the ones that had kept her standing when other things fell. She thought about a man who had kept a bottle of rose perfume because it smelled like something he wanted to remember, and she thought about the particular difficulty of being the person he had wanted to remember. She went to the garden when she got home and turned soil for an hour, which was her method for thinking. Friday morning she rode back to the breaks. This time Joel had a second tin cup ready, which she pretended not to notice as particularly significant. They talked for 3 hours. She told him about the dairy operation, about the cows, about the market in Caldwell, about the particular satisfaction of the vegetable garden which she had made into something genuinely productive. She told him about her father in the years she had known him best, the middle years before the debt and the decline, when he had been a particular kind of man, steady and interested in the world and genuinely funny in a dry, quiet way. She told him about Thomas, who was good-natured and willing and not particularly careful, who had gotten the best of their father's warmth and not quite enough of their father's caution. Joel told her about the Chisholm Trail and the years he had driven it, the scale of it, the vastness of moving 10,000 head of cattle through 600 miles of territory, the way it had felt like being part of something enormous and necessary. He talked about Texas in a way that told her he missed it without quite saying so. He talked about the trail hands he had known, some of whom he was still in occasional contact with, men scattered across the territory now doing legitimate work. He did not romanticize the years between. He spoke of them plainly, without self-pity or self-dramatization, and that plainness was the thing Abigail found herself trusting most. She had been lied to by men who dressed up their bad choices in elaborate justification. Joel Barnett seemed to have a real and particular discomfort with the period between 1879 and 1882, and the discomfort was not performed. "I have one more question," she said, at the end of the third hour when Clara was beginning to show signs of impatience. "All right," Joel said. "The wildflower," she said. "The violet. You went out of your way to find one in early April on rocky ground. You left it specifically, not as part of the box, not in a note, but separate on the step. Why?" Joel was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran. The cottonwoods moved. "Because I wanted to leave something that was just from me," he said. "Not restitution, not repayment, just," he stopped, "just something that was mine to give." Abigail held very still. "I see," she said, in a voice that was remarkably steady given what was happening inside her chest. She rode home, and she did not go to the garden this time. She stood at her kitchen window for a long while, looking at the prairie violet in the water glass on the sill, which was still alive and still as purple as the morning she had found it. And she had a very serious conversation with herself about the nature of forbidden feelings and practical sense, and what it meant to be a woman alone on the Kansas frontier in 1883, who had just spent 3 mornings talking to a reformed outlaw by a creek. The conversation with herself concluded with the observation that she had been alone on the Kansas frontier for 2 years, and it had been entirely survivable and not particularly joyful, and that the past 3 mornings had been the most alive she had felt since before her father died, and that she was 26 years old, and she had the right to make choices that were not entirely about survival. Thomas came on Saturday as she had asked. She showed him the deed. His reaction was everything she had expected, bewilderment and then a flood of emotion he tried to contain and mostly could not, and then a long stretch of questions about how it had come back. She told him the truth, all of it. Thomas sat at her kitchen table in silence for a very long time after. He was 24 and he looked young in that silence, younger than his years. "He is in the break south of town," Thomas said finally. "Yes, and you have been talking to him 3 times. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands. "Abigail," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what it looks like." "Do you?" Thomas said, not unkindly. "Because what it looks like is that you are getting attached to the man who took everything from us, and who your own good judgment should be telling you is trouble." "My judgment," Abigail said carefully, "is telling me something more complicated than that." Thomas looked at her for a long time. He was not a stupid young man, her brother. He had their mother's perceptiveness beneath the recklessness. "Is he a good man?" Thomas said, not sarcastically. As a real question, Abigail thought about it honestly. "I think he was a man who made very bad choices for a period of years," she said. "And I think the choices he has made since have been consistently better and increasingly harder, and I think he is trying to become something more solid than what he was. Whether that constitutes good, I cannot tell you yet." Thomas absorbed this. "I want to meet him," he said. "I expected you would." "Before you get any further into whatever this is," Thomas said, with the particular mixture of protectiveness and anxiety of a younger sibling who has watched his sister hold the family together for 2 hard years. "Before I get any further," Abigail agreed. The meeting happened on Sunday afternoon. Abigail rode out to the breaks and told Joel that her brother wanted to see him, and Joel said yes without hesitation. They arranged it for the following Tuesday, which gave Hayes time to get word back from the marshal's office. The marshal's office response came on Monday. Hayes sent a boy out to the homestead with a note asking her to come in, which she did. Hayes told her with his customary brevity that given the voluntary cooperation, the full accounting, the returns made, and the absence of any outstanding warrants in the state of Kansas, the federal marshal's office was prepared to close the file on Joel Barnett contingent on a period of 2 years of documented law-abiding residence and employment in the territory. Essentially, Hayes said, he is free, with observation. That is a generous assessment from the marshal's office, Abigail said. He turned himself in, Hayes said simply. In my experience, that is rare enough to count for something. On Tuesday afternoon, Thomas rode out to the breaks with Abigail. It was a meeting that made her quietly anxious, though she kept that to herself. Thomas had his father's temper underneath the good nature, and the card game and the deed and the 40 acres were a fresh wound despite the return. Joel was standing by his horse when they came through the cottonwoods, not seated, not armed, just standing. Abigail read the deliberateness of that, the choice to be upright and visible and unarmed, and she appreciated it more than she could have explained. Thomas dismounted without looking at Abigail and walked straight to Joel and stood in front of him and looked at him for a long moment. Joel looked back. Neither of them said anything for what felt like a considerable time. The deed came back to us, Thomas said finally. Yes, Joel said, the 40 acres is back in my name. Yes. My father is still dead, Thomas said, and his voice cracked on the last word which he had not meant it to, and he pressed his mouth shut and looked away. Yes, Joel said very quietly. That does not come back, I know that. Another silence. The creek ran. Brinkman is a fair man to work for, Thomas said, still not looking at him. He pays on time. He does not cheat on the provisions. A pause. If you are looking for work for the drive, you should know that. Joel was quiet for a moment. I will keep it in mind, he said. Thomas nodded once, got back on his horse, and looked at Abigail with an expression that said about 15 different things simultaneously, most of which came down to, I am not happy about this, but I am not going to stop you. He rode back toward town. Abigail looked at Joel. That was generous from Thomas, she said. More than I deserve, Joel said. Probably, she said. Do not waste it. He almost smiled again. More than almost this time. I will try not to, he said. She did not go home immediately. She stayed by the creek for another hour, and they talked in a way that was different from the previous conversations, lighter in some way, as if something that had been held at a formal distance had shifted slightly closer. They talked about the spring, about the drive season starting, about Caldwell's particular character. He asked her about the dairy operation with genuine interest, and she found herself describing it in more detail than she usually bothered with, because he asked good follow-up questions and listened with his full attention in a way that was uncommon enough to be notable. When she finally mounted Clara to go, the afternoon light was long and golden across the breaks, and the cottonwoods were throwing their new shadows across the creek. Are you going to look for lodgings in town? She said. I was thinking the boarding house on Front Street, he said. That would be Mrs. Kellerman's. She is strict about the rules of the house, but she runs a clean operation and the food is decent. That sounds like a recommendation. It is, she said. You should go into town tomorrow. Start being visible and ordinary. It is better for you. She paused. And come to the market on Saturday if you are free. I have a stall on the east side. She said it looking slightly past him at the cottonwoods, and she felt rather than saw the way he held the invitation carefully. Saturday, he said. All right. She rode home in the long golden light and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something was beginning rather than simply continuing. Joel Barnett moved into Mrs. Kellerman's boarding house on Wednesday of that week, paid a month in advance from what remained of his funds, and spent Thursday and Friday presenting himself at the places where a man looking for legitimate work on the Kansas frontier went. The Brinkman Ranch was the main one. He rode out on Thursday and spoke to Jed Brinkman himself, a large, quiet man of about 50 with a reputation for good judgment, and laid out his history plainly and simply and let Brinkman decide what to do with it. Brinkman hired him for the spring drive at the standard wage. Thomas's presence in the bunkhouse was noted by both men and neither discussed it, which was probably the best possible outcome. On Saturday morning, Joel came to the market. Abigail's stall was easy to find, second from the east end of the market row. A clean, well-organized setup with dairy goods and early spring vegetables, and 3 varieties of preserves she had put up the previous fall. She was in conversation with a customer when he arrived, and she saw him out of the corner of her eye, and the simple fact of seeing him in the ordinary daylight of the Caldwell market, in the middle of the weekly noise and commerce and neighborly bustle, did something to her that a careful person would have identified as hope. She finished with her customer and turned to him. He was holding a brown paper parcel. He set it on the edge of her table. "I did not come empty-handed," he said. "It is coffee. The good kind from the general store." "That is very thoughtful," she said, which was an understatement. Good coffee was a genuine luxury in Caldwell in 1883. He stayed for 2 hours, helping carry when she needed something carried and stepping back when customers came, and at the end of the market when she was packing up, he helped her load Clara without being asked. They walked the 2 miles to her homestead together, Joel leading his gray horse beside her. The road was easy and the morning was bright and warm for April, and they talked easily all the way, and when they got to her fence, he helped her carry the remaining goods inside and stood in her kitchen for the first time, which was a moment she was aware of in a complicated way. He looked at the water glass on the windowsill. The prairie violet was still there, dried now but kept, its purple gone to a softer mauve. He did not say anything about it. Neither did she. She made coffee with the parcel he had brought and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the box had sat 5 days before, and they drank coffee in the Saturday afternoon light, and the conversation moved easily between them, the practical and the personal both at home in the same space. And Abigail thought that this was what she had missed without knowing she missed it. Not company exactly, but this specific kind of company, where the silence was as comfortable as the talking, and you did not have to manage either. He left before supper, walked back to Mrs. Kellerman's and turned at the gate and looked at her standing in her doorway and said, "Thank you for the coffee." "You brought the coffee," she said. "Thank you for the company then," he said. "Come again next Saturday," she said. The weeks of April settled into a rhythm that Abigail found she was not inclined to disturb. Joel rode out to the Brinkman Ranch on weekdays, where Thomas reported cautiously, and then with increasing frankness that he was a good worker, knew cattle as well as anyone on the crew, and was, on close inspection, someone Thomas could see himself working alongside without the arrangement being entirely unworkable. This progress report came in stages over several Sundays, and Abigail received each installment with the care it deserved. On Saturdays, Joel came to the market, and then walked the road to her homestead and stayed the afternoon. They were never alone in ways that would have alarmed Mrs. Holt, who was 60 and observant, and had formed opinions about Joel Barnett that were more charitable than Abigail might have expected, because Mrs. Holt was also someone who put more weight on behavior than history when the behavior was consistent, and the history was being honestly accounted for. In the 3rd week of April, while sitting on the front step in the late afternoon, Joel asked Abigail if he could show her something, and she said yes, and he produced from his coat pocket a small, careful drawing on a folded piece of paper. It was a plan, rough but intelligible, for a small homestead expansion, an additional barn section, and a better enclosure for the dairy cows that would improve production through the winter. "I have been thinking about it," he said. "You mentioned the issue with the cold in the current setup." She looked at the drawing for a long time. It was a good plan. It was specific to the actual layout of her homestead in ways that told her he had been paying careful attention. "You were listening," she said. "I was," he said. She looked at him, sitting on her front step in the April afternoon, serious and careful and trying in every small, concrete way he could find to prove something that could not be proved by grand gestures but only by the accumulation of small, honest ones. "I would like your help building it," she said. "In the summer, when the drive is back." Something in his face opened up. "I would like that," he said. The spring drive took Joel north with Brinkman's crew in early May, and in his absence, Abigail continued her days with an awareness that the shape of her life had changed, that something had been added to it which was now present even when the person was not. She worked her garden and managed her dairy and went to the market and talked to Mrs. Holt over the fence and lived the full practical life she had built, and she was not unhappy in it. But she noticed the quality of her Tuesday and Wednesday evenings, which had become the ones where she sat by the lamp with her mending, and allowed herself to think about the barn plan and the Saturdays and the particular way Joel Barnett laughed, which was rare and genuine, and transformed his whole face when it happened. He sent one letter from Abilene, which arrived in the third week of May. It was a short letter. He wrote about the drive, the country north of the breaks, the particular quality of the Kansas sky at this time of year when the grass was fully up and the wind moved through it in long, slow waves. He asked about the dairy cows. He wrote at the end that he hoped she was keeping the violet. She had kept the violet. She wrote back care of the general delivery at Abilene, 2 pages in her clear script, about the garden and the market, and a funny exchange with Mrs. Holt about a disputed property line that had become an occasion for a complex negotiation over a shared apple tree. She wrote that Clara had thrown a shoe and that the blacksmith in Caldwell had done an excellent job. She wrote that she was looking forward to the barn project. She did not write about the violet, but she pressed a small dried sprig of prairie sage between the folded pages, which was a different kind of answer to the same question. The Brinkman crew came back to Caldwell in the third week of June, trail-worn and paid, and generally in good spirits. Joel arrived at her gate on the Saturday of that week, looking considerably leaner than he had left, but with something in his face that was more settled than before, as if 6 weeks of hard, honest work on the open range had done something useful to a restlessness she had been aware of underneath his calm. Thomas came for Sunday supper that week, which he now did regularly, and the 3 of them sat at Abigail's table and ate and talked, and Abigail watched her brother and Joel, who had spent 6 weeks on the trail together, and saw that something had shifted there too. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a mutual regard that was rooted in the specific competencies of the trail, who could keep his head when steers broke at night, who could read weather, who did his share without complaint. Thomas was not a man to give easy trust to anyone who had wronged his family, but he was also not a man who could watch someone work hard and honestly alongside him for 6 weeks and not update his assessment. The barn project started in July. Joel came out on the long summer evenings after his days at the Brinkman Ranch, which had moved into summer maintenance work, and they worked together on the new enclosure through the golden late afternoons. Abigail worked beside him, because she had always worked her own land and was not going to stop on account of having help, and the project became something she looked forward to in a way that had as much to do with the company as the construction. They talked while they worked, the kind of talking that was easiest when hands were busy, and they moved around each other in the work with an ease that developed naturally over the days of it. She noticed that he always worked toward her comfort without making a demonstration of it, adjusting where he stood, handing tools before she had to reach for them, taking the heavier end of things without negotiation. She noticed that he noticed when she was tired and suggested breaks at those moments, not before. She noticed that when he was trying to think through a problem, he went quiet in a specific way that she had learned to recognize and leave undisturbed, and she noticed that he had learned the same about her. It was on a Wednesday evening in late July, when the new enclosure was nearly finished, and they were sitting on the unfinished top rail in the cooling air at the end of the workday, that something shifted out of the careful space they had been maintaining into something that could not be called anything but what it was. They had been quiet for a while, watching the light go out of the sky over the prairie in the way it did in July, slowly and in colors. "I need to say something," Joel said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited without helping him because she had learned that he needed to find his own words, and the best thing she could do was hold the space for it. "I came back to Caldwell because of the debt I owed you and your family," he said. "That is the honest account of why I started. I want you to know that I know the difference between what I owed you and what I want now. They are not the same thing. The debt is done. What I am about to say has nothing to do with the debt." Abigail's heart was moving at a different speed than it usually did. "What I want now," he said, and his voice was careful and very steady, "is to be allowed to try to earn something that is not repayment. That is more than repayment. I want to ask if I can court you properly, with your full understanding of what I am and what I have been and what I am trying to become." The July evening was warm and still around them. The prairie stretched to the horizon. "Joel," she said. "Yes." "I kept the violet," she said, "and the sage letter. And I have been at this fence every evening for 3 weeks, and I have been counting the hours between the times I see you for considerably longer than that." She paused. "The answer is yes." He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had glimpsed pieces of all these months, the one that was full of feeling that he had been managing carefully, and now it was fully present. "All right," he said, which was not eloquent but was the most genuine thing he could have said. They sat on the fence rail in the July evening until the stars came out, their shoulders touching, and Abigail Dawson felt the particular fullness of a life that has turned a corner and found itself pointing somewhere better. The courtship of the summer and fall of 1883 was conducted with the particular combination of passion and propriety that the frontier required of respectable people. They were careful in the ways that mattered, visible and socially legible in their arrangement, and private in the ways that were their own. Joel came to the homestead every evening that he could, and when the Brinkman Fall Drive started in September, they wrote letters that grew longer and more honest with each week. And when the drive came back in November, they continued the project of knowing each other with the accumulated knowledge of all the months behind them. Thomas had moved, by October, from guarded acceptance to something that was almost fraternal. He did not say this in direct terms, because Thomas expressed affection through practical assistance and occasional pointed jokes, but he helped with the barn project on his Sundays, and he invited Joel to the Brinkman Hands Thanksgiving gathering, and he stopped adding qualifications to his references to Joel in conversation with Abigail, which was as close to a full endorsement as she was likely to get from her brother. On the first Sunday of December, Joel asked Abigail to walk with him on the road south of her homestead in the late afternoon, which was unusual enough in the cold that she understood something was happening. They walked in the winter light, their breath visible, the prairie flat and pale around them. He stopped at a particular point in the road, which she recognized as the place where the prairie violets grew in spring, the ones that pushed up through the rocky, disturbed ground by the fence post. "There are no flowers in December," he said. "No," she agreed. He reached into his coat pocket and produced something he had been carrying. He held it out to her. It was a ring, plain silver, set with a small amethyst stone, the particular purple of prairie violets. "I had it made in Wichita on the September drive," he said. "I have been carrying it since November." A pause. "I wanted to ask you here at this spot specifically." Abigail looked at the ring and then at him, and then she looked at the ground where the violets would come up in April and then back at him. "Joel Barnett," she said. "Yes." "You are the most deliberately thoughtful person I have ever met," she said, which was the highest compliment in her vocabulary. "Is that a yes?" he said, which was as close as he had come to being anxious in front of her. "It is emphatically a yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and they stood in the December road with the winter wind moving around them and the prairie violet ground empty and waiting for spring. And she looked at him in the winter light, and thought about the morning she had come downstairs to find a box on her kitchen table, and the wildflower on her step, and how the whole long arc from that morning to this one had been a map of choices, his and hers and Thomas's, choices toward honesty and accountability and the slow, difficult work of becoming someone better than you had been. She put her hand against his face and he went very still, the way he did when something mattered too much to perform. She had learned to read that stillness. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee." They were married in the spring of 1884, on the first warm Saturday of April, in the small Caldwell church with its whitewashed walls and its slightly warped floorboards, with Thomas standing for Joel and Mrs. Holt standing for Abigail. Hayes came, which surprised some people and pleased Abigail, because she thought it appropriate that the sheriff who had allowed Joel his 48 hours and his chance should be present for what the chance had led to. Several of the Brinkman hands came, and Mrs. Kellerman from the boarding house, and assorted Caldwell neighbors and market regulars, who had formed their own opinions of Abigail Dawson and Joel Barnett over the preceding year. The ceremony was short, and the celebration afterward was held at the homestead, where the new barn enclosure stood solid and well built in the April morning, and the garden was just beginning to show the first green of the spring planting, and in the rough ground along the fence where the prairie soil was disturbed by the post holes, a cluster of purple violets had pushed up through the clay, exactly as they did every year, small and stubborn and entirely committed to being alive. Joel noticed them during the celebration, standing with Thomas near the fence, and he went very still for a moment, and then looked across the gathering to find Abigail, and she was already looking at him from across the yard, because she had seen the violets too, and their eyes met over the noise and color of their wedding morning with the particular completeness of two people who share a reference that belongs only to them. The first year of the marriage was a building year in every sense. Joel continued with Brinkman through both drives, the spring north and the fall, and the wages he brought back went into the homestead with a focus that was practical and joyful at once, because building something together was different from building something alone, and both of them felt the difference daily. The dairy operation expanded. They bought a 5th cow in May of 1884 and a 6th in the fall. The vegetable garden produced a surplus large enough that Abigail began selling to the restaurant on Front Street as well as the market stall. They were not wealthy. The frontier did not offer that easily. But they were stable in the deep sense of the word, stable in their finances and their routine and their regard for each other. And stability on the Kansas frontier in the 1880s was a kind of wealth that anyone who had lived without it could recognize. The second year brought new things. The territory was changing around them, as it had been changing for years, the cattle trails shifting with the expansion of the railroad, Caldwell's role evolving, new settlers coming in and older arrangements adapting. Joel made the shift from seasonal trail work to a permanent position with Brinkman as foreman of the home operation, which was a better arrangement for all of them and meant he was home every night rather than gone for months on the drives. Thomas, in that second year, brought a young woman from Wellington to Sunday supper. Her name was Hannah, a schoolteacher's daughter, quick-minded and warm, and Abigail watched her brother with this person across the supper table with the particular fondness of someone who has been hoping for something without saying so. Thomas and Hannah were married in October of 1885 and settled on Thomas's 40 acres, which had been lying fallow and was now, with Thomas and Hannah's combined energy, being turned into a real working homestead. In the late fall of 1885, Abigail told Joel in the evening after supper that they were going to have a child. She said it simply, as she said most important things, across the kitchen table with the lamp between them. Joel was quiet for a moment, the particular stillness that meant something mattered too much to perform. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and held her for a long time without saying anything, which was the right response. Their son was born in July of 1886. They named him Robert Thomas Barnett, after Abigail's father and her brother, which felt right to both of them in a way they did not need to discuss at length. He was large and loud and healthy, and Thomas came the next morning with Hannah and held his nephew with the expression of a man encountering a new and overwhelming kind of love. And Abigail watched her brother holding her son in the summer morning light and felt the fullness of it. The way things that had broken had been rebuilt into shapes that were different from before but not lesser. The way the long arc of the years since the October night on the Wellington Road had curved eventually to this. Joel held Robert in the evenings with a focused tenderness that Abigail had not anticipated and which moved her every time she saw it. He had not had a model for it, she understood. His father had been someone who left rather than stayed, and Joel Barnett's choice to stay every day, to be present and deliberate and consistently there, was not something he did automatically. It was something he chose, and the choosing was visible in it, which made it more rather than less. The homestead continued to grow. A second child, a daughter they named Alina Rose, came in the spring of 1888, small and dark-haired and possessed of strong opinions about things she encountered, which she expressed at volume. Robert, by then nearly 2, regarded her with a mixture of fascination and competitive anxiety that was entirely typical of his age. The barn expansion Joel had drawn on that paper in their early courtship had long since been completed, and they had added to it since. The dairy operation was now substantial enough to have a permanent account with 2 merchants in Caldwell and 1 in Wellington. The vegetable garden supplied both the restaurant and the hotel. The 40 acres of Thomas's property next door had been developed into a grain and livestock operation that worked in complementary ways with Abigail and Joel's dairy, and the 2 households had built a kind of extended economy that made both more stable than either could be alone. In the evenings, when the children were in bed, Joel and Abigail sat together on the front step of the homestead in the way they had developed in the early months of the courtship. The front step had become their place for the kind of talking that needed the open air and the stars, the conversations about plans and memories, and the particular texture of what they were building. One such evening in the summer of 1888, with Robert asleep and Alina at last settled after her characteristic resistance to the concept, they sat in the warm July air and looked at the road south of the homestead where the prairie violets grew along the fence. "I have been thinking about something," Joel said. "Tell me," she said. "I want to ride back to Pratt County," he said. "Not to stay, to visit. My sister and her husband have a place near Dodge now. I have not seen her in 6 years." He paused. "And the homestead where I grew up, I want to see it even if it is someone else's now. I want to look at it." Abigail thought about this. "I will come with you," she said. He looked at her. "The children, Thomas and Hannah, will take them for a week. Hannah has been asking for more time with Alina since she was born." She paused. "You should not do that alone, Joel. You should have someone with you when you see it." He was quiet for a moment. "You would do that," he said. "I would," she said. I want to know the places that made you before I met you. I want to see the Chisholm country, and I want to meet your sister." She looked at him. "You have been carrying the past alone for a long time. You do not have to do that anymore." He put his arm around her in the July evening, and she leaned into the solid reality of him, and the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, and the road south was pale and quiet, and somewhere along the fence line the prairie violets were waiting for their annual April arrival, stubborn and necessary, and entirely committed to returning no matter what the winter had been. The trip to Pratt County and then west to Dodge City happened in September of 1888, when the worst of the summer heat had passed and the trail to Dodge was in good condition. Thomas and Hannah took the children, Robert solemn and curious about the arrangement, Alina entirely unconcerned, as long as the routine of meals and attention was maintained. Joel and Abigail rode west together through the September country, which was extraordinary, the late summer grass going golden, the sky the particular deep blue it achieved in early fall, the country opening up as they moved west in the way that always made Abigail feel both very small and very alert. They found the old Barnett homestead on the second day. As Joel had said, someone else's now. A family named Wickham who had been there since 1881 and had built considerably on the original structure. Joel sat on his horse at the edge of the property line for a long time looking at it, and Abigail sat beside him and did not say anything and did not move away. After a while he said, "It is smaller than I remembered." "It always is," she said. "There used to be a cottonwood at the corner of the fence," he said. "It is still there." "Yes," she said, "it was." He looked for another minute and then he turned his horse toward Dodge City. She rode beside him without speaking, because she knew when silence was the right thing, and this was one of those times. His sister was a woman named Clara, 27 years old, with her brother's dark eyes and a directness that Abigail found immediately appealing. She was married to a man named Garrett Webb who ran a small freight operation out of Dodge, and they had 2 young children, a boy and a girl. Their house was modest and well kept, and the welcome they received was genuine. The evening they spent at the Webb house was the best thing about the trip. Clara embraced Joel at the door with the specific fierceness of a sibling who has been separated for a long time, and then held him away and looked at him and said, "You look better than I expected," which was not a complicated statement but which meant something. She turned to Abigail and said, "You must be extraordinary because he chose well," and Abigail liked her immediately. They stayed 3 days with the Webbs, and in those 3 days something loosened in Joel that Abigail had been aware of as a tightness without quite being able to identify it. He talked to his sister in the evenings in a way that was different from how he talked to anyone else, freer, with more of his history in it, and Abigail listened from across the table and understood more about the person he had been before she met him. On the last evening, sitting on the Webb's porch in the Dodge City September air, Clara said to Abigail quietly while Joel and Garrett were talking, "He wrote to me after he went to Caldwell, after he brought back the things he had taken. He said he did not expect you to want anything to do with him. He said he just needed to do the right thing and then go somewhere else." "He was wrong about that," Abigail said. "He was," Clara said. "Extraordinarily wrong." She looked at her brother across the porch. He needed someone who was not afraid of his history, who could look at the whole of him and not flinch. "The history is part of it," Abigail said. "You cannot have the man he is now without the road he took to become him. I would not try to separate those." Clara looked at her with approval. "Take care of him," she said. "He takes care of me as well," Abigail said. "That is how it works." Clara laughed, warm and genuine. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly how it works." They rode back to Caldwell over 3 days, and the September country was beautiful around them the whole way, and they talked the kind of talk that 2 people who know each other well have on long rides, easy and ranging and comfortable with the silences between. By the time they came into Caldwell and turned south toward the Homestead Road, they had talked about everything from the children to the future of the dairy operation to what they thought would become of Caldwell now that the cattle era was beginning its long, slow change with the railroad spreading, to the question of whether they wanted to add to their family, which was a conversation that concluded warmly and without resolution in the best way. Thomas came with the children the evening they returned, Robert running to them across the yard in a way that was entirely gratifying, Alina proceeding with somewhat more dignity at 14 months, but reaching for Abigail with clear insistence. Joel swung Robert up, and Robert immediately began a detailed and not entirely coherent account of everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks, which Joel listened to with complete attention, asking questions at the appropriate moments. Abigail stood in her doorway with Alina on her hip and watched her husband with her son in the autumn evening, and saw Thomas and Hannah coming across the yard looking tired and happy, in the way of people who have been doing the intensive good work of other people's children for 2 weeks, and saw her homestead in the October light, the barn solid and the garden fallow-ready, and the cottonwood at the edge of the property in its autumn gold. She thought about the October morning she had come downstairs to find a box on her kitchen table and the wildflower on her step. She thought about how it had felt like an ending of something and had turned out to be the beginning of something else entirely. She thought about betrayal and dark pasts and forbidden feelings and all the things she had named in herself and then had to make peace with naming. She thought about the forced choice she had faced, which was not really about Joel at all but about herself, about whether she was the kind of person who could allow a complicated truth to become the foundation of something instead of the reason to step away. She thought she had chosen well. They all had supper together that evening, the 6 of them around Abigail's expanded table, and the lamp was bright and the food was good, and Robert fell asleep in his chair before dessert, and Joel carried him to bed with the ease of practice, and Alina fell asleep in Abigail's arms against her chest, small and warm and entirely trusting, and Thomas said across the table with a smile that had none of the old guardedness left in it, "You two look disgustingly happy, you know." "I am aware," Abigail said. "Good," said Thomas, and helped himself to more pie. In the spring of 1889, the prairie violets came up along the fence line as they always did, pushing through the disturbed clay in the first warm days of April, purple and persistent, and entirely unreasonable in their beauty given everything they had to push through. Joel came home from his work at the Brinkman Ranch one April evening to find Abigail on the front step, sitting in the late afternoon sun, with Alina standing in the doorway behind her clutching the doorframe for balance, and Robert somewhere in the yard investigating something with great seriousness. He stopped at the gate and looked at the scene. "What are you looking at?" Abigail said. "Everything I have," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. "Come here," she said. He came through the gate and sat beside her on the step, and she pointed to the fence line where the violets were up, a small cluster of them, purple and alive. "Every year," she said. "Every year," he agreed. Alina, deciding that the doorframe was a sufficient foundation, took 2 unsteady steps forward and then sat down with great decisiveness on the step between them. Joel put a steadying hand on her back. She looked up at him with her dark eyes, completely unimpressed by the fact that she had just walked for the first time, as if this were merely the expected result of reasonable effort. Joel laughed, the real laugh that changed his face, and Abigail laughed with him, and Robert came running from the yard wanting to know what was funny, and the evening was warm and the violets were up along the fence, and the homestead was solid and full, and everything that had been taken had been returned, and more than returned, because the returning had been the beginning of something that now stood in the April light, layered and whole and entirely alive. In the months that followed, Caldwell continued its evolution. The cattle trade was shifting, the drives getting fewer as the railroad pushed further south, but the town was adapting, becoming more settled, more permanently oriented toward agriculture and trade rather than the seasonal drama of the cattle season. This suited Abigail and Joel well, because their own lives had been moving in that direction since the beginning, toward something rooted and continuous rather than seasonal and transient. Joel took a position as ranch foreman full-time with Brinkman in 1889, which meant a steady wage and a more regular life. Thomas's 40 acres were producing well. The extended family of Dawsons and Barnetts and Webbs, now including Clara and Garrett, who visited from Dodge City twice a year, had the warmth and productive complexity of people who had genuinely chosen each other. The 3rd child arrived in November of 1890, another boy, whom they named William Joel Barnett. He came in the night in a hard November rain that turned to early snow by morning, and by the time the snow had stopped and the morning was bright and white and cold, he was sleeping in his cradle, and Robert was regarding him with the complicated calculation of an eldest child assessing a new rival, and Alina was less interested in the baby than in the snow, which she was extremely interested in. And Joel stood in the kitchen doorway between the room where Abigail was resting and the main room where the children were, and Abigail could see from where she lay that he was holding the two spaces together with his whole self, the way he held everything, steadily and with full attention. "Oh," she said. He turned. "Come and sit with me," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put her hand in his, and they sat in the November morning with the snow outside and the baby in his cradle and the children's voices in the other room. And the ring with the amethyst stone was on her hand still, the small purple of it the same shade as the prairie violets that would come up again in spring as they always did. She thought about the note on the kitchen table. "I took what was not mine to take. This belongs to you, every piece of it. I am sorry." She thought about everything that had been returned, the locket and the watch and the deed and the money, and she thought about the thing that had arrived with it, separately as its own gift, placed on the step rather than in the box, because it was not restitution and it was not repayment but something else, something that had no name that fit exactly but that had turned out to be the whole of what mattered. She held her husband's hand in the November morning. Outside, the snow was white and the sky was clearing. In the yard, Robert had found his coat and was making urgent use of the snow. Alina would follow in approximately 4 minutes, with or without appropriate clothing. The prairie was quiet under its white cover. The fence line where the violets grew was buried, as it was every winter, as it had been every winter since before she had ever known what a prairie violet on her step could mean. But spring was the same distance away it always was. Not as close as summer, not as far as it felt in December. And when it came, the violets would be there again, pushing through the cold clay, purple and persistent and entirely committed to returning. The way certain things returned, the way certain people returned, to give back what they had taken and leave one wildflower on your step and change everything. Abigail Dawson Barnett looked at her husband in the November morning and felt the particular warmth of a life that had been built honestly, from difficult materials, by two people who had both, at different times and in different ways, needed to find their way back to something true. William made a small decisive sound in his cradle. Joel turned to look at him and then back at Abigail, and the expression on his face was the one she loved most, the fully open one, the one that had nothing managed in it, pure and unperformed. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she said. "For opening the door," he said, "when you could have left it closed." She thought about the morning she had stood in that doorway, the box on the table behind her, the flower on the step before her, the empty road and the cottonwood in the early wind. "I found a wildflower on my step," she said. "What else was I going to do?" He smiled. She smiled. Outside, the snow sparkled in the emerging sun, and William Barnett slept, and Robert shouted something triumphant about a snowball, and Alina's voice was heard demanding her coat, and Abigail Dawson Barnett, 29 years old, well-loved and well-rooted on the Kansas frontier, held her husband's hand in the morning light and was, simply and completely, home.